Good morning. This is Nathan Keller. Welcome back to Gravity, a place to keep you grounded in the Scriptures even when you can't make it to church. I'm reminded of a famous military guy. He was nicknamed Old Blood and Guts. He took the qualities of previous generals and made them his own. He took Grant's fearlessness. He took Jackson's aggressiveness. He took MacArthur's theatrics. And he even took the mobility of General Forrest's cavalry and applied them to his tanks. That general was the general every United States general wanted to be since World War II. It was General Patton. He once said, "A pint of sweat will save a gallon of blood," and that is the point of the series that we started several weeks ago called The Frontline. We're supposed to take the time to train now so that when real trials come, we'll be ready. And the first thing we Christians must do is to take the ownership of our faith. When you do this, you see you enrich, you deepen your faith, but there are a few distractions that can stunt a Christian's growth into self-ownership of their faith. And so that distraction today is our feelings. I want you to imagine that there's a woman who sits with her friends on the couch and she's blowing off steam and she starts to tell about how her husband's not fulfilling her needs, and she's like, "Man, maybe we should need some time apart." Well, in their wisdom, her friends say, "Well, listen to your feelings." Somewhere else, there's a boy who's been rejected by his peers. He's had a really bad day, and he gets on Facebook to blow off steam, and he tells people how bad life is and how much he wished sometimes it would just end. And his friends, with 10 seconds of investment and wisdom, they write in the comments section below, "Listen to your feelings." Also, we've got major icons in the media who say things like, "I feel as if all people will get to the same place at the end," or "I feel God is in every man." And the distraction is quite often that little word, feelings. I want you to understand something. The first thing in owning your faith is understanding this, that quite often your faith will be tested in how you follow God regardless of how you feel. That's what a lot of people don't understand. I want to read for you an article, and I want you to listen to the words in it. It says, "Faith is feeling and acting as if the thing you want has happened. Faith is taking God at His word. You feel His supreme authority. You feel assurance. You listen and obey His word because you feel confident that what He says shall come to pass." Now, if feeling, this was a comment that I had read when I was doing research for an article. If faith is a feeling, then when you feel God is the almighty supreme authority and you feel as if He's doing a great job with His job and you have that great assurance and everything's going good, well then, hey, yeah, you are right. It's a great day. You have great faith in that case. But what about when things get tough? We've all felt alone at times. What about those times when you feel alone? You feel depressed. Is your faith good then if you follow your feelings? One thing that I've experienced is people come up to me, and when they're in very difficult situations, they ask me this question. They say, "Nathan, why can't I feel God?" Now, if feeling guides us, and people don't have a good understanding of their faith, and what begins to happen is an erosion of the faith that they have, and they begin to answer that question, "Why can't I feel God?" with answers like this: "Well, maybe He doesn't love me," or "Maybe He doesn't exist," or "Maybe I'm not saved." And see, that's why following feelings is bad. It can get you into trouble. Paul writes this, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 14. I hope you realize I'm not going to pause every time for you to turn to the scriptures. You got a pause button yourself. So, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 14 says this: "We should no longer be children, tossed to and fro and carried away with every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of man, and the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting. But speaking the truth in love may grow up in all things into Him who is the head, Christ." What he's saying here is we need to mature out of that state in which as children we obey and we listen and we are learning. We need to get out of that state eventually and get into a place where we understand what's going on. We need to understand and be solid and have a solid foundation. And one thing that cannot give you a solid foundation and be a good guide is feelings, because one moment you're up here and one moment you're down here. I'll give you an example. When I was coming to this church, hoping to get the ministerial job here, I came and preached for them a few times, and my family came down with me. They brought me into the conference room that's about 20 feet that way, and they asked me, "You want to be our minister here? We'd like you to stay." And it was in that moment, woo, I was so excited. I felt like I was the executive in the business room with the owner of the CEO, and we were like, ooh, same wavelength. I was like, God and I are one. You kind of feel as if everything's just going your way. And in my head, in that moment, I was screaming. I was going, woo, really loud. I would show you like I showed my congregation, but the problem is the speaker would start to do that weird rattly thing. My toes in my shoes were dancing. There's a rock band. I was having so much fun in my head. I was on cloud 9. But then I get home, and now it's time to tell the principal. I tell the principal, give her the letter of resignation and everything. But the most difficult day was the last day of school in the spring. You have to do the whole checkout process, get the checklist checked so you can leave, and the last thing on the checklist was your key if you weren't coming back. So I get my key. I still remember its shape that I'd had for 6.5 years. I take my key down to the principal, and that key represented a lot of things. It represented chalk, the smell of chalk. It represented 7:30 a.m. Being at work. It represented taking my kids to daycare. That thing just represented predictability and comfort, right? Well, it represented that, and when I walk into her room, to the principal's room, to give her the key, my jaw begins to shake and my eyes begin to tear up, and she doesn't know what to do. And I give her the key, but before I could give her the key, you see, I had to do something my feelings would not let me do. I went home, and when I went home, Andrew was already on the couch, and I sit next to her, and I put my shoulder on her, or my head on her shoulder, and I began to cry because everything was changing. If I would have listened to my feelings, I would never have come to be a minister here at Westward Church of Christ, because it was a difficult change, moving to a new town, meeting new people, doing new work. And so we need to make sure that it is not our feelings that guide us, it is our faith that guides us. And so because of that, we need to remember there's something we got to do. If we want to own our faith, we have to give our faith the respect it is due. And so let's do that. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This is the main point of our faith. It says, verse 3, "For I, Paul, delivered to you first of all that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures." What's the fact? Christ died. He was, according to the Scriptures. He was buried. He died the third day according to the Scriptures. Those are the facts. That is the center of our belief, and it is by that center we find our faith. Without that, without the resurrection, there's no purpose for what we do. It's not tied to worship. It's not tied to women's role. It's not tied to any of those things. It is simply tied to belief in Jesus and the resurrection. Now, I want to show you an analogy. This analogy is one that I've got from one of the Grahams. I think Franklin Graham. It's a very good analogy, and it's the train analogy. I want you to think about the locomotive. How far is the locomotive going to get without the coal car? Maybe a couple miles. How far can the coal car get without the locomotive? Nowhere. How far can the caboose get without either? Not nowhere at all, right? Now, this is a great analogy for the relationship between fact, faith, and feeling. And we need to remember, what comes first? It is the facts. The facts, ma'am. Simply the facts. Simply facts, man. I got it wrong. But that's okay. It's the facts, right? For example, our faith is begun by the fact that Christ died, was buried, and rose from the grave, right? That's the fact. But without faith, it wouldn't have gotten very far. People believed in it. Now, notice also that faith does not generate fact. All right? Just like I can't sit here in my office and say, I have faith that God will give me $1 million in a bag right now in front of me, and it occur. It's not going to happen, right? Faith cannot generate fact. Fact happens, then you believe. You begin to have faith in that. And finally, what's along for the ride? The feelings. Now, about faith, I want you to think about the fact that Jesus once told Thomas in John chapter 20, verse 29, he said this, Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. In other words, he's saying that the people like him or the apostles have all seen him and they believe. That's great. But later on, there's going to be a whole bunch of people who believe in him and have never seen him. Now, you and I were not there the day that Christ came into the inner chamber where the apostles were at and let Thomas touch his hands and his sides. But we've read the Bible. I myself have studied other religions during college with an attempt to find the best one. I tell you, I landed in this one because it makes the most sense. It's the only one where the deity, the God, comes and loves you and gives his son for you. Now, in Hebrews, there's the famous faith chapter. Notice it's not called the feelings chapter. It's called the faith chapter, right? In that, you've got people like Abraham, you've got Sarah, you've got Moses, and it doesn't really talk about their feelings. It talks about how their faith guided them and pushed them to do the things they did. But if you think about Abraham, how do you think he felt when he had to leave the land of his fathers? Probably felt pretty sad having to say bye to his family. But he had faith. Sarah, if she would have listened to her feelings and not her faith, she'd never have a child. How do we know that? Because when God said she was going to have a kid at the age of 90, what'd she do? She laughed. Right? It is not our feelings that determine our actions. It is our faith that determines our actions, despite our feelings in many cases. And feelings are always there. And so we need to understand that while they're always there, they never cause us to do what we do. The faith causes us to do what we do. So then the question becomes, what is the purpose of feelings? Should we just become automatons? The answer is no. There's a great purpose in them, and I want to illustrate for you that purpose. I want you to imagine, regardless of how good of a visitor you are, or a minister, or a counselor, imagine you stink, all right? You go to visit somebody's house. They let you in. They let you sit in their favorite chair, and you sit down there for a while. You may talk about the weather or the sports, but then you get to this point where there's nothing to talk about, and you just kind of twiddle your thumbs, and you have that awkward silence. You know what I'm talking about. It's like that same awkward silence where you say bye to someone next to the elevator and you have to wait like 10 minutes for the elevator to get there. Awkward, right? Well, you have the same awkward silence. But then you see this statue on the coffee table. Conversation piece, right? It's a cat chasing a Great Dane, and you ask them about that. They say, well, I got it in Thailand. Oh, tell me about Thailand. And you talk more to them about that statue. It starts so much conversation. You talk more now than you ever have before. You learn more about them and about yourself. Now, what is the statue? The statue is your feelings. Okay? Your feelings act as a social lubricant. Who's the person that you're visiting? It could be a Christian, it could be a non-Christian. You know what? It could also be God. Sometimes we go through dry spells with our prayers. Even I do, many ministers do. But a good way to get over that is to talk to God about your feelings. You know, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 6 says, "Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time." Humble yourself, and he will exalt you. And it says, "Cast all your cares on him, for he cares for you." Tell him how you feel. Only when you confront your anxieties before God can you actually begin to build a relationship with him in the first place. He wants to hear those anxieties. He wants to hear them from your own lips, and then he'll exalt you. Now, feelings serve as a social lubricant, but they also serve as a way to show you what's going on inside of you. Now, they tell you what's going on inside of you. They tell you about the status of your walk, but very rarely do they indicate, where you're walking to. You might be a very good Christian. You may have a great relationship with God, but you feel alone because you're going through a divorce. The divorce is a storm in your life, and how you feel the aloneness, the depression indicates the storm, but it never tells you really what to do. It's your faith that tells you what to do. And your feelings just say, hey, there's a storm. That being said, there's a third thing feelings can do. Galatians chapter 5 tells us about the evidences of the flesh as well as the better, fruits of the Spirit. But the evidences of the flesh list things like jealousy, hate, wrath, and envy, right? Those are evidences of the flesh, meaning you're not going to hell, but they're evidence that you're human. Now, if we look at that and we talk to God about our status there, then it can serve as a way for us to know what we need to fix, and God can help us fix that. We can pray to him, he can help us fix that, and we'll also become closer to him. Now, that being said, we need to really work on making sure that our kids understand that, and our young Christians understand, they need to make their faith their own. Your faith is not your grandpa's faith. Your faith is your faith. Start by remembering this. Your feelings they go along with you in your walk, right? Acknowledge them, and God willing, control them, but never, ever be slaves to them. Be slaves to Jesus. Be slaves to your faith. And that's when your faith becomes your own. I want to say one last thing. Sometimes the teaching element within the church, like myself or parents or grandparents or elders or deacons, are kind of like a commanding officer who gives a bad weapon or unchecked weapon to a soldier who's never used one. Okay? Sometimes we give the kid a weapon they've never used, and like the sword, the Bible, and we expect expert results, like they're a seasoned professional. And guess what? That's not going to happen. People make mistakes. But what we do need to understand is that we need to trust and know our weapon. We need to teach our children to trust and know their weapon. Trust and know, yes, the Bible, the sword of the Spirit, but also to know their faith in general. Trust it. And that only comes when you begin to practice with it. Take ownership of your faith. Only then can you prepare yourself for the battle on the front lines. That's the first part of the series on the front lines. It's been a few weeks since I've given that lesson, so I was reading my notes more so than usual. God bless.